I was standing in the frozen foods aisle of a grocery store in Asheville when my phone buzzed and my daughter-in-law's name lit up the screen. I remember the exact moment because my hands were numb, not from the cold, but from the way my stomach dropped before I even answered. Some instincts arrive before reason. Some betrayals announce themselves quietly. "Margaret, don't come tonight," she said without greeting. "We canceled the dinner." Her voice was clipped, efficient, like she was rescheduling a dentist appointment, not dismissing a 68-year-old woman who had been planning Thanksgiving for weeks. I stood there between the peas and the frozen pies, holding a carton of vanilla ice cream I had bought because my grandson liked it with apple crumble. "Canceled," I repeated. "Is Daniel all right?" A pause. Not concern. Calculation. "He's fine. We just decided it would be easier without the extra pressure." You understand. Extra pressure. That was me now. I did not understand, but I said I did. That is what women like me were trained to do. I put the ice cream back, paid for my groceries, and walked out into the brittle November air with a feeling I could not name yet. It felt like grief, but sharper. Like something had snapped cleanly instead of breaking slowly. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 68 years old. I live alone in a cedar-sided house I paid off 15 years ago after 4 decades of teaching high school English. I raised one son, Daniel, mostly by myself after his father walked out when Daniel was 9. I taught him how to tie a tie, how to drive, how to apologize when he was wrong. I thought I had taught him loyalty. That night, I did not go home right away. I drove aimlessly through downtown Asheville, past the restaurant where Daniel once told me he proposed to Claire, past the courthouse where I had testified in a curriculum hearing years ago, past the small Italian place with warm lights glowing against the dark. That is when I saw them. Through the wide front windows, I saw Daniel at a long table, wine glass raised, laughing. Claire sat beside him in a fitted emerald dress I had never seen before. Around them were people I recognized from their Christmas card list. Friends, couples, people who were, apparently, not extra pressure. On the table sat platters of food, bottles of wine, and right in front of Claire, my credit card. I recognized the chip sticker because I had put it there myself to tell it apart from the others. I had given it to her that morning. "Just in case we need to pick up something special for dinner," she had said sweetly. "You know, last-minute things." My ears rang. I watched as a server leaned in, smiled, and placed another bottle on the table. Claire clapped her hands. Daniel kissed her cheek. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not go inside. I opened my banking app with fingers that no longer shook. The charge was already pending. An amount large enough to make my breath hitch, but not large enough to surprise me anymore. I pressed cancel. Permanent cancellation. Fraud suspected. Then I stood there and watched. Less than 2 minutes later, Claire's smile faltered. She leaned toward the server, her brow creased. She pulled out her phone, typed quickly. Daniel followed. Then she looked up. Our eyes met through the glass. She did not look ashamed. She looked irritated, like I had interrupted something. I walked away before they could come out, before Daniel could call my name, before I could say something that would give them the comfort of thinking this was just another misunderstanding I would smooth over. That night, I sat alone at my dining table with the Thanksgiving place cards still laid out. Margaret, Daniel, Claire. Empty spaces where people who used to matter had been quietly removed. I did not sleep. By morning, I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. This was not new. This was simply the first time I had seen it clearly, and I was done being invisible. The morning after Thanksgiving arrived gray and merciless. Rain tapped steadily against my kitchen window, each drop punctuating a thought I could no longer push away. I sat at the table with a mug of coffee growing cold between my hands, and opened the drawer where I kept paperwork I rarely touched, because trust had always felt easier. I began with the credit card statements. At first, I told myself I was being dramatic, that I would find a few dinners, a few clothes, nothing worth destroying a family over. That was the voice of the old Margaret, the one who believed love meant endurance. January, a luxury spa in Charleston. I had not been invited. February, boutique charges, several in one afternoon. March, airline tickets to Napa Valley, 2 seats. I stopped breathing somewhere between April and May. I pulled out my old ledger, the one I used to track household expenses when Daniel was in college. Page after page, filled with numbers I never authorized, but always absorbed. By the time I reached October, the total stared back at me like an accusation. Tens of thousands of dollars. Not stolen in one dramatic act, but siphoned, quietly, confidently. Like they assumed I would never look. I pushed my chair back and paced the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tile. Every memory rearranged itself with brutal precision. The last-minute excuses, the shortened phone calls, the way Claire always answered questions with a laugh that made me feel foolish for asking. I turned on my tablet next, intending only to distract myself. Instead, I found the final cut. Daniel had logged into his email on it months ago and never logged out. I should not have read it. I know that. But there are moments when truth demands to be witnessed, not politely avoided. There was a message thread labeled Planning. Claire wrote first. We need to accelerate. She's healthy now, but things change fast at her age. Daniel replied hours later. I know. Just don't push too hard. She gets sensitive. Sensitive. Another message. Once the will is updated, we can relax. She won't fight if it feels like her idea. My vision blurred. I closed the tablet and pressed my palms flat against the table until the shaking stopped. They were not careless. They were methodical, and I had funded every step. That afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel's name. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, he said cautiously. Claire said your card stopped working. There must be a mistake. No, I said calmly. There isn't. Silence. Then irritation slipped through. Why would you do that without talking to us? I smiled to myself, a slow, unfamiliar expression. That's an interesting question, Daniel. He exhaled sharply. You embarrassed us. There it was. Not apology, not concern. Embarrassment. I'll call you back, I said, and ended the call before he could respond. I stood in my living room, surrounded by furniture I had paid for, memories I had curated, a life I had built deliberately. And for the first time, I understood something Ruth, my late colleague, used to say. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be consumed. I did not want revenge driven by anger. I wanted justice shaped by clarity. I wanted them to understand exactly what it felt like to lose the ground beneath their feet without warning. I reached for my phone again, this time scrolling until I found the number of a woman I had not spoken to in years. Linda Morales, estate attorney, former student, sharp as winter air. When she answered, I did not hesitate. Linda, I said, my voice steady. I need to protect myself, and I need a plan. She paused only a moment. Then you called the right person. I looked out at the rain, at the house that was still mine, at the future they assumed they already owned. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. They were about to learn the difference. Linda arrived 2 days later with a leather briefcase and the kind of calm that only comes from having seen everything before. She looked around my living room as she sat down, taking in the framed photos, the carefully kept shelves, the order I had always maintained. You take care of things, she said, not as a compliment, but as an observation. People who exploit others usually choose someone like you. That stung, but it also felt accurate. I handed her the statements, the printed emails, the notes I had taken in shaky handwriting at 3 a.m. She read silently for a long time, lips pressed together, eyes sharp behind thin glasses. This is not accidental, she finally said. And it's not just family drama. There is potential financial abuse here. The words settled heavily in my chest. Abuse was something that happened to other people, women with bruises, elderly strangers on the news. Not me. Not a retired teacher who prided herself on independence. They were planning to change my will, I said quietly. Linda nodded. And isolate you while doing it. That's a pattern. I felt a flicker of something new. Not fear. Focus. What do I do? I asked. She leaned forward. First, we lock everything down. Accounts, access, powers of attorney. Second, we observe. We don't confront yet. I frowned. Observe what? How they behave when the money stops, she said. That tells us everything. That evening, Daniel showed up, unannounced. He stood on my porch, hands in his coat pockets, jaw tight. The boy who once needed help with spelling words was gone. In his place stood a man who expected explanations from me. "Why are you shutting us out?" he asked as soon as I opened the door. I did not invite him in. "Why were you using my money without telling me?" I replied. He blinked. "We were managing things. You said we could." "For emergencies," I said. "Not vacations and spa retreats." His face hardened. "Claire works hard. She deserves some comfort." "And I deserve honesty," I said. He scoffed. "This feels dramatic." I felt something crack then, not painfully, but decisively. "You're not coming in tonight," I said. He stared at me. "What?" "You're not welcome in my house until we talk with lawyers present," I continued calmly. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "You're being manipulated." I smiled sadly. That's what people say when control slips. I closed the door before he could respond. My heart raced, but beneath it was a steady pulse of resolve. The next day, the calls started. Claire first, then Daniel, then his mother-in-law, a woman who had never once called me before. I answered none of them. Instead, I met Linda at our office and signed documents I never imagined needing. Revocations, amendments, protections. Each signature felt like reclaiming a square inch of myself. As I left, Linda said something that stayed with me. "Margaret, revenge isn't loud. It's patient." That night, I slept for 4 uninterrupted hours for the first time since Thanksgiving. And in my dreams, I was no longer apologizing. Silence does strange things to people who are used to access. By the end of the week, Claire could not tolerate it anymore. She called from an unknown number, her voice syrupy sweet. "Margaret, darling, we're worried about you." I laughed softly. "That's new." "You've been distant," she continued. "Daniel is beside himself." I imagined him pacing, frustrated not by my absence, but by the loss of leverage. "I'm fine," I said, "just reorganizing my affairs." A pause. Then tension. "There's no need to involve lawyers. Families handle things privately." I pictured her scanning documents, calculating timelines. "Families also don't lie to each other," I replied. Her tone sharpened. "You're misunderstanding everything." "No," I said. "I finally understand it." She hung up. 2 days later, Linda called me into her office again. She had news. "They've already contacted an estate planner," she said. "Someone aggressive." My stomach clenched. "Can they do anything?" "Not without your consent," she assured me. "But it tells us they're moving faster." That evening, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Daniel. He apologized vaguely, spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about how families hurt each other sometimes. Not one sentence acknowledged the money. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a folder labeled Evidence. The next escalation came quietly. A neighbor mentioned seeing Claire near my house earlier that day. "Just checking on you." Checking on me. I installed new locks the following morning. A week later, Linda called with a tone I had not heard before. "Margaret, I need you to come in. There's something else." In her office, she slid a document across the desk. "This was filed yesterday, a petition questioning your capacity." My breath caught. "They're saying I'm incompetent?" "They're suggesting you're vulnerable and being influenced," she said carefully. "By me." I sat back, stunned by the audacity, the cruelty disguised as concern. "They're trying to take control," I whispered. "Yes," Linda said. "And now, we stop playing defense." She outlined the next steps: medical evaluations, court hearings, evidence presentation. As she spoke, a strange calm settled over me. This was no longer about money. It was about my name, my mind, my right to exist without being managed. When I left her office, the winter sun was low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked slowly, feeling every year of my age and every ounce of my strength. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote in my journal. They think age makes me weak. They think silence means consent. They are wrong, because they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated how dangerous a woman becomes when she has nothing left to lose except her dignity. And I was done losing. The court notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through my mail slot like an accusation. I stood in the hallway holding it, my coat still on, grocery bags cutting into my fingers. For a moment, I simply stared at my own name, printed in bold letters, followed by words that felt surreal. Petition for evaluation of capacity. They were asking a judge to decide whether I was still myself. I set the bags down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile inside me. Then I sat at the kitchen table and read the document line by line. Phrases jumped out like quiet insults. Advanced age, susceptible to influence, recent erratic financial decisions. Erratic. The word burned. I had spent my entire life being predictable, responsible, reliable. And now, the first time I acted in my own interest, I was labeled unstable. I called Linda. They filed, I said. I know, she replied calmly. I was already reviewing it. How bad is it? Not bad, she said, but revealing. They're escalating. By that afternoon, she was in my living room again. Papers spread out, strategy shifting from quiet containment to deliberate exposure. This is where many people fold, she said. They apologize. They soften. They try to seem agreeable. I won't, I said without hesitation. She nodded. Good. Because we're going to let them show exactly who they are. The plan was simple, but emotionally brutal. I would remain silent. No explanations. No defending myself to Daniel. No responding to Claire's messages. Every reaction they wanted would be denied. Instead, we gathered proof. Bank records, email timestamps, testimony from my physician, statements from colleagues who had known me for decades, women who had seen me manage classrooms of 30 teenagers without losing my composure. They said I was confused. We would show consistency. 2 nights later, Daniel came again. This time, he did not knock politely. He pounded. "Mom!" he shouted through the door. "This is getting out of hand." I stood on the other side, heart pounding, hand resting on the lock. "You're humiliating us," he continued. "Claire is crying. People are asking questions." I opened the door just enough to look at him. "You filed a petition to take away my autonomy," I said quietly. "And you're worried about humiliation." He looked startled, then defensive. "We're trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked. "My own decisions?" He sighed dramatically. "You're not thinking clearly." I met his eyes. "Leave." "Mom." "Leave," I repeated. He stared at me for a long second, searching for the version of me that would fold. When he did not find her, something in his expression shifted. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. He left without another word. The next day, Linda called with unexpected news. "Daniel reached out to my office," she said. My stomach tightened. "Why?" "He asked about withdrawing the petition." I closed my eyes. "Claire won't let him." "No," Linda agreed. "But the fact that he asked matters." For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something like pity for my son. He was trapped between loyalty and conscience, and neither side would forgive him easily. The hearing was scheduled for early January. Christmas passed quietly. No dinner, no gifts exchanged. Just a card from Daniel with a brief message, wishing me peace. I placed it in the same folder as the others. On New Year's Eve, I sat alone with a glass of wine and watched fireworks on television. As the clock struck midnight, I whispered something I had not said in years. I choose myself. And I meant it. Because the next chapter of my life would not be negotiated through guilt or fear. It would be claimed. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. I sat at the small table beside Linda, hands folded neatly in my lap, spine straight. Across the room, Daniel sat rigidly beside Claire. She wore black, as if mourning something already lost. She did not look at me. The judge entered, a woman, perhaps 10 years younger than me, her expression composed and unreadable. I found comfort in that. Neutrality felt safer than sympathy. Proceedings began with Claire's attorney speaking softly, carefully, as though concerned for my well-being. He talked about isolation, about vulnerability, about how certain individuals might influence an elderly woman into making decisions against her own interests. Linda stood calmly when it was her turn. She taught high school for 40 years, she said. She managed budgets, committees, curriculum reforms. She lives independently, pays her bills, volunteers, votes, drives. And only when she questioned unauthorized spending Did her family decide she was unwell? The judge raised an eyebrow. I was called to speak. As I walked to the stand, I felt my knees tremble slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. This was not about money. This was about my mind. I understand why we're here, I said steadily, but I want to clarify something. I am not confused. I am disappointed. I described the charges, the dinners, the trips, the emails. Not emotionally, factually. When the attorney asked if I felt lonely, I answered honestly. Yes, I said. But loneliness is not incompetence. When he asked if I was angry, I nodded. Yes, I said. Anger is not confusion either. The judge listened closely. Then Daniel was called. He looked at me once, then away. When asked why the petition was filed, he hesitated. The silence stretched. My wife was concerned, he finally said. The judge tilted her head. And you? Daniel swallowed. I didn't want to upset anyone. The courtroom seemed to inhale as one. The judge leaned back. This court does not remove autonomy because someone avoids discomfort. Her decision came swiftly. Petition denied. A murmur rippled through the room. Claire's face drained of color. As we stood to leave, Claire finally looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, furious. This isn't over, she whispered as she passed. I looked at her calmly. For you, I said. It is. Outside, the air felt cleaner. Linda smiled. You did beautifully. I nodded, but my attention was elsewhere. Daniel stood near the steps, shoulders slumped. Mom, he said quietly. I waited. I didn't think it would go this far, he admitted. I studied him, this man I had raised. It always goes as far as people allow. He nodded, eyes wet. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it. And that did not change what came next. Because justice does not require cruelty, but it does require consequences. And Daniel was about to face them. After the hearing, something fractured that could not be repaired with apologies. Daniel did not come home with Claire that day. I learned that from a text he sent just after dusk. One sentence, no explanation. I'm staying with Mark for a while. Mark was his college roommate, the one I had helped pay rent for when Daniel was unemployed after graduation. Another quiet thread of irony I simply noted and released. Claire, on the other hand, did not retreat quietly. 2 days after the petition was denied, rumors began circulating. A former colleague called to ask if I was all right. A woman from my book club hesitated before asking if everything was okay at home. Concern dressed up as curiosity. Claire was planting seeds. Linda confirmed it when she forwarded me an email from a mutual acquaintance. Claire had suggested I was becoming erratic, that grief had changed me, that maybe I needed help but was refusing it. She was reframing the loss of control as my instability. I did not respond. Instead, Linda and I moved forward with the next step, the one I had been avoiding emotionally, but not strategically. We filed a civil claim. Unauthorized use of funds. Breach of fiduciary trust. Financial exploitation of an older adult. Seeing those words attached to my own family hurt more than the court hearing ever did. But truth often hurts before it heals. The filing triggered immediate consequences. Daniel called me that night, his voice strained. Mom, my accounts are frozen. Yes, I said. What did you do? I protected myself, I replied. The same thing you said you were doing. He was quiet for a long moment. Claire is furious. I imagine she is. She says you're trying to ruin us. I closed my eyes. Daniel, I am trying to survive what you allowed to happen. He exhaled sharply. I didn't know it was this bad. You knew enough, I said gently. The next escalation came from Claire directly. She showed up at my house while I was gardening. No warning, no call. Just her standing there in sunglasses and fury. You've crossed a line, she said, ripping off the glasses. I wiped my hands on my jeans and faced her. You crossed it first. You're making us look like criminals, she hissed. You behaved like criminals, I replied calmly. She laughed bitterly. You think a lawsuit makes you powerful? No, I said. Clarity does. She stepped closer. Daniel will choose me. I met her gaze. Then he will live with that choice. Her mouth opened, then closed. She had expected pleading, bargaining, tears. I offered none. She left without another word. 2 weeks later, the consequences became public. The business Daniel worked for had been quietly audited after the civil filing flagged unusual transfers. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just enough scrutiny to unravel fragile structures built on borrowed money. Daniel resigned before he could be dismissed. He told me over coffee, eyes hollow. I didn't want them to fire me. I nodded. That was wise. I feel like everything is collapsing, he said. I looked at him. Really looked. Sometimes collapse is the only way to see what was unsound. Claire moved out 3 days later. She took furniture, jewelry, art. Anything she could argue was hers. She did not take Daniel with her. When he came to my house a week after that, he looked smaller, not defeated, exposed. I let her turn you into a resource, he said quietly. And I let myself believe that was normal. I did not reach for his hand. I don't need you to hate her, I said. I need you to understand why this cannot happen again. He nodded slowly. I'm starting to. The lawsuit moved forward methodically. Negotiations, evidence, offers of settlement. Claire wanted it to go away. I wanted accountability, and the gap between those desires would soon decide everything. The settlement conference was scheduled for early spring. By then, the sharpest pain had dulled into something steadier. Not forgiveness, not peace. Something closer to acceptance, sharpened by resolve. Linda prepared me carefully. They will try to minimize, she said. They will frame this as misunderstanding. I smiled faintly. I spent my life teaching teenagers. I know how deflection works. Daniel arrived early. Alone. Claire was late. When she entered the room, she looked polished, composed, as if this were a business meeting she expected to win. Her attorney spoke first, emphasizing reconciliation, family unity, the desire to avoid prolonged conflict. Linda listened, then slid a folder across the table. Emails, bank statements, timeline. Unity does not excuse exploitation, she said calmly, and misunderstanding does not explain sustained deception. Claire's attorney skimmed, then stiffened. Claire glanced at Daniel. He did not look back. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I did not file this because I wanted revenge, I said. I filed it because silence had already cost me too much. Claire scoffed. You're exaggerating. I turned to her. You planned my future without me. You spent my past without asking. And you tried to take my present by questioning my mind. The room was silent. Daniel swallowed hard. The settlement terms were simple. Full repayment of the misused funds over time. Legal fees covered. A formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And most importantly, no future financial authority over me under any circumstance. Claire objected, loudly. Daniel did not. When he signed, his hand trembled. Claire stood abruptly. You're choosing her. Daniel looked up. I'm choosing responsibility. She laughed sharply. Enjoy being alone. She left without looking at either of us. Afterward, Daniel sat quietly. I don't know who I am without her, he admitted. That's something you get to discover, I said. That evening, I walked alone through my neighborhood. Spring air cool against my skin. I passed houses lit warmly from within. Families gathered around tables. For the first time, that sight did not sting, because I was no longer measuring my worth by inclusion. I was measuring it by integrity. The lawsuit closed not with triumph, but with relief. I recovered most of what was taken. I forgave the rest. Not for them, for me. When I went home that night, I opened my journal and wrote, Justice does not restore what was lost. It protects what remains. And what remained was something I had not expected to find. Myself. The first quiet week after the settlement unsettled me more than the chaos that came before it. There were no calls to brace for, no documents to review, no strategy sessions with Linda. Just silence, wide and unfamiliar, stretching across my days like an empty room I had not yet learned how to furnish. I woke early out of habit, brewed coffee, sat at the table, and waited for something to demand my attention. Nothing did. That was when the exhaustion finally reached me. Not physical, emotional. The kind that settles into your bones once adrenaline releases its grip. I spent a full afternoon doing something I had not allowed myself in years. I rested. I read without underlining. I napped without guilt. I let the quiet exist without trying to fill it. Daniel called on the fourth day. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "can I come by?" I considered it. Not out of fear, but out of intention. "Yes," I said, "for coffee." He arrived looking careful, like a guest rather than a son. He brought pastries from the bakery down the street. The one I liked, but rarely visited because Claire said it was overpriced. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising between us. "I moved into a smaller apartment," he said, "near downtown." "That sounds practical," I replied. He nodded. I needed to reset. He hesitated, then spoke. "Claire's been telling people you destroyed our marriage." I sipped my coffee slowly. "And what do you tell them?" "That I let it happen," he said quietly. I looked at him then, really looked. The defensiveness was gone. In its place was something fragile and raw. "I'm starting therapy," he added. "Not because you asked. Because I need to understand how I became someone who justified hurting you." I felt a swell of emotion I did not rush to soothe. Growth required discomfort. "I'm glad," I said simply. He looked down at his hands. "Do you hate me?" The question was small, earnest. "No," I said after a moment. "But love doesn't mean immunity anymore." He nodded, absorbing that truth. When he left, I did not feel drained. I felt measured, like a boundary had been drawn, not in anger, but in clarity. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected invitation. A letter from the County Education Board inviting me to speak at a forum on elder financial literacy. Linda had recommended me, apparently, citing my case as an example of systemic vulnerability. My first instinct was to decline. Then I remembered how invisible I had felt, standing outside that restaurant window. How easy it had been for my voice to be dismissed. I accepted. The forum was held in a modest auditorium. I stood at the podium, lights warm on my face, and told my story without names, without bitterness. I spoke about trust, about gradual erosion, about how manipulation rarely announces itself loudly. Afterward, women approached me quietly, thanked me, shared fragments of their own stories. I realized then that my experience had not isolated me. It had connected me. That night, as I locked my front door, I noticed a car parked across the street. Engine off, lights dark, my pulse quickened. The car door opened. Claire stepped out. She looked thinner, sharper, less polished. I did not move. She approached the edge of my yard, stopping just short of the porch light. "You think you won," she said flatly. I met her gaze. This was never about winning. She smiled coldly. "You humiliated me." "You humiliated yourself," I replied. She leaned in slightly. "Daniel will come back to me. He always does." I shook my head. "Not this time." Her eyes flashed. "You don't know that." I smiled calmly. "Neither do you." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her car. As she drove away, something inside me settled. The past was done reaching for me, but the future still had one final test waiting, and it would arrive sooner than I expected. The call came from Daniel's therapist. I did not know her personally, but Daniel had listed me as an emergency contact weeks earlier. At the time, I had agreed without thinking much of it. Now, her calm voice carried urgency. "Your son is safe," she said, "but I believe he needs support." I drove to his apartment with a steady hand on the wheel, and 1,000 thoughts colliding quietly in my mind. When I arrived, Daniel sat on the couch, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, with a familiar pain I recognized too well. The pain of finally seeing yourself clearly. "She contacted me," he said before I could speak. "Claire?" I asked. He nodded. "She said she was pregnant." My breath caught. "And?" I asked carefully. "She wasn't," he said. "It was a lie." But I didn't know that at first. I sat beside him, close enough to be present, far enough not to overwhelm. "She said she needed money," he continued. "Said it was for medical care. Said I owed her." "And what did you do?" I asked gently. "I almost believed her," he admitted. "I almost called you." The room was quiet. "I didn't," he added quickly. I stopped myself. I turned to him. "Why?" He swallowed. "Because I realized that part of my life is over. And because I knew you wouldn't fix it anymore." I nodded. "That's true." He let out a shaky laugh. "It's terrifying." "Yes," I said. and necessary. We sat there for a long time without speaking. "I don't want to repeat this pattern," he said finally. "I don't want to replace one dependency with another." "That's wise," I replied. He looked at me then, eyes clearer. "Will you still be in my life?" "I already am," I said. "Just not as your safety net." He nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand the difference." Over the next weeks, he stabilized. Therapy continued. The apartment began to feel like his. He cooked for himself, paid his own bills, made his own mistakes. I watched from a distance, not disengaged, but no longer entangled. One afternoon, Linda invited me to lunch. "You've done something rare," she said. "You didn't just protect yourself. You modeled accountability." "I didn't feel brave," I admitted. "Bravery rarely feels heroic," she said. "It feels necessary." That night, I sat on my porch and listened to the spring insects hum softly in the dark. My house felt different now, lighter, like it belonged fully to me again. But I knew there was one last chapter left, not about Claire, not about Daniel, about what I would do with the life I had reclaimed. And that choice, I realized, would be the most powerful one of all. I did not rebuild my life all at once. It happened quietly, in small, deliberate choices that felt insignificant at first, then accumulated into something solid. The first choice was selling the house. That decision surprised everyone, including me. I loved that house. I had painted its walls, repaired its gutters, memorized the way sunlight moved across the living room floor in every season. It held decades of proof that I had existed, mattered, endured. But it was also tied to a version of myself who had accepted less than she deserved. I listed it in early summer. When the offer came in, strong and clean, I did not hesitate. I signed the papers with a calm hand, not mourning what I was leaving, but honoring what it had given me. I moved into a smaller place near the river. One floor, wide windows. No guest room waiting for someone who might never come. The furniture fit. So did I. With the remaining funds, I did something I had postponed my entire adult life. I invested in myself. I enrolled in a writing workshop at the community college. Not to publish, not to perform, just to remember the pleasure of shaping truth into language. On the first day, a woman asked why I was there. "Because I finally have something to say," I replied. Daniel visited occasionally, always respectful, always calling first. He never asked for money. He never hinted. When he spoke, it was about work, therapy, learning to live without shortcuts. One afternoon, as we walked along the river path, he stopped. "I understand now," he said. "You didn't punish me. You stopped rescuing me." I nodded, and that saved both of us. He smiled, sad but sincere. "I'm grateful." So was I. Linda and I met for lunch one last time before she retired. "You know," she said, stirring her tea, "your case changed how I practice." I raised an eyebrow. "I listen more carefully now," she said, "especially when older women say something feels wrong. Too many people dismiss that instinct." That pleased me more than any legal victory ever could. Claire faded from our lives slowly. No dramatic exit, just distance. The occasional rumor, the faint outline of someone who once believed control was permanent. It never is. In the fall, I spoke again at another forum, then another. I was invited to join a small advisory board focused on elder advocacy. I accepted without hesitation. I was no longer afraid of visibility, because I understood now that silence is only safe for those in power. On my birthday, Daniel brought me a simple gift, a leather-bound journal. "For your next chapter," he said. I hugged him, briefly, firmly. When he left, I sat by the window, journal open on my lap, and wrote a sentence that felt like a promise. I will not disappear again. And I meant it. Because what came next was not about revenge. It was about release and rebirth. The anniversary arrived without ceremony. 1 year since the night outside the restaurant. 1 year since I realized exclusion was not an accident, but a design. I marked it quietly. That morning, I walked along the river early, mist rising off the water, the world hushed and waiting. I breathed deeply, aware of my body, my age, my strength. I was 70 now, and I had never felt more awake. In the afternoon, I volunteered at the legal clinic Linda had helped establish before retiring. I sat with a woman named Carol, her hands trembling as she described how her son controlled her accounts to help. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I said the most important thing I had learned. "You're not wrong to question this," she cried, not from despair, but from relief. That evening, Daniel called. "I just wanted to tell you," he said. "I got promoted." "That's wonderful," I replied. "I earned it," he added. "I know," I said. We talked about nothing important. And everything. After we hung up, I stood at my window watching the lights along the river flicker on, one by one. Lives unfolding, choices being made, futures quietly changing course. I thought about what revenge really meant. It was not humiliation. It was not destruction. It was refusing to remain the version of myself that made betrayal possible. The greatest power shift was not legal or financial. It was internal. I was no longer excluded. I had removed myself from a system that required my silence to survive. And in doing so, I had claimed something no one could take from me again: my dignity. If you are listening to this and recognize yourself in any part of my story, hear me clearly. You are not too old to change. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like it. Share in the comments where you are listening from and what part of this journey felt closest to your own. And subscribe to this channel if you believe, as I do now, that it is never too late to reclaim your power. This was my story. And if you stayed until the end, perhaps it is also the beginning of yours.